Hi, and welcome back to Unraveled, another episode with my colleague and friend, Eileen Ruhoy. We're doing
We have
this by
different
Zoom.
backgrounds.
Yeah, I know. We're doing this by Zoom again. We will be going back to the studio, so we'll mix and match here the different formats. Um, I think we both enjoy the studio a lot as well, but it's a time crunch issue and a scheduling issue. So today we're going to talk about rapamycin. We've hinted at it, mentioned it, sort of skirted
Well, a couple
around
of
the.
housekeeping things, though, I think,
Oh
David, if
yeah,
you
right,
don't
right,
mind.
right.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So we are not formally doing stuff on Patreon where we're still having people sign up and pay, and I've been refunding as they pay. So while we will use Patreon for various purposes, like for certain live episodes, for example, where you can ask questions and it's interactive, right now what we're doing is YouTube and mainly YouTube. And so which is free. So you don't have to pay. So I'm trying to get the word out that people can stop buying
Yeah.
subscriptions off of Patreon. We have been, like I said, refunding it, but we just want people. Clearly people did not get the message or did not know, and so please don't subscribe on Patreon just yet, even though the page is still active. So you could sign up for free. Actually, that's a really good point. You could sign up and not buy a subscription. You can sign up as a free member, and there is back and forth. And we get notices when you put a message on, and we try to respond as quickly as we can. Sometimes we don't get to it right away, but it is a good page for now of where we can be interactive with our subscribers and listeners. And so we like it for that reason, which is why that page is still there. But we don't want people to have to pay any longer. So
Right, right.
that's one thing. And then the other thing is that David, Dr. Kaufman, agreed to be on social media. So follow
I may
both
live
of
to
us,
regret this.
follow both of us on Blue Sky, which was what he agreed to for now. So
It has nothing to do with Twitter, of course, and nothing to
no,
do with the current state of the
nothing at
country.
all.
No.
He will establish an account. Doesn't have one as of this moment, but he promised that he will. And I will tag him when he does. And then we're going to be posting some things of that we're doing on YouTube. But so follow us on social media at Blue Sky. I'm on at Blue Sky. I forgot what my handle is on Blue Sky, but on Twitter or X, it's at RuhoyMD. And then my Instagram is Eileen RuhoyMD PhD. But we're going to have a Blue Sky account. In fact, we should probably have an Unraveled Blue Sky account, David. So anyway, we'll
Okay.
think about that. But anyway, so we'll be on social media as well. So
And we,
that's
and we would encourage other people who are on Twitter to move over to Blue Sky.
yes. It's been a slow exodus, but there's definitely been an exodus going on. But we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you, but go ahead.
No, that's okay. No, good. So like I said, we've mentioned rapamycin several times. There's been lots of material written up about it, certainly on things like Health Rising, and patients have talked about it. So we thought we would devote this episode to rapamycin, both to discuss the drug and its efficacy, what it does biochemically, and also the results of the trial that I've been working on with some co-investigators, um, which has been really exciting. So let's start just with what is this drug? All right.
What is it?
Eileen, I'm not sure how much detail to go into historically. It's got a really interesting history. I
It
think
does. Yeah.
people know it, but maybe I'll just spend a minute on it. So the drug has been around for over 50 years, actually just had its 50th anniversary. Um, it was discovered in the
Easter Island.
Easter Islands, like the
Yeah.
name, Easter Islands. Um, by a group of scientists that went there literally to look for drugs. They harvested or looked for fungi and plants and stuff, which is often the source of drugs that we use, and big pharma turns into drugs. So this guy, whose name I don't remember now, discovers this stuff and brings it back, thinks it's great, does a lot of testing as a biochemist or a drug designer. I forgot the term they use. But then the pharmaceutical company that employed him said, we don't want to do this. Throw it away. And the guy would not throw it away. He stuck it in his freezer. And then years and years later, he moves to a different pharmaceutical company, pulls it out of the freezer, starts the research on it, and thus was born the drug to transform transplantation medicine by providing a degree of immune suppression so organ transplants would not be rejected by their host. It's an amazing story. I mean,
And it
there's a
was
lot.
initially an antibiotic.
Right, antifungal and antibiotic. It's a story worth looking up because I'm leaving out a lot of details for the to save time. Um, but it is amazing, and it's a classic drug discovery story and how close we came to losing this drug completely. Okay, so then in the course of many years, it's always been used for transplants um, and as an immunosuppressant. And then about 2006 or 7, after research on its use in different ways, Joan Manick, a physician scientist working at, do you remember what company she was at?
No.
I
I
forget.
don't.
And yeah,
Which-
she did a trial,
Mhm.
this very elegant trial using low-dose rapamycin in people 65 and older to assess its effect on their immune system and on their vaccine response. So there were two groups, well, more than two groups. There was a placebo, a dose of roughly 6 milligrams a week, a dose of roughly 1 milligram a week, and a dose of, I think, 5 milligrams a day, more or less, okay? And the outcome of that trial was quite astounding. The 6 milligram a week and the 1 milligram a day had the same outcomes, which I'll tell you in a minute, and the same level of adverse effects, which was pretty much the same as the placebo group. Okay. So in this, people that received those two doses, they had a marked improvement in the way they responded to flu vaccine. That was the biomarker they were using. Meaning they developed higher levels of antibodies to the flu vaccine. Important to note, if people don't realize it, that as we get older, yay me, our immune system supposedly declines and we become less responsive to flu vaccine. Thus, those of you over 65, Medicare will pay for a double strength flu vaccine for that reason. Okay, so they had improved flu vaccine response, but what was not anticipated is that over the following year, and they only took the drug for something like 2 months. Over the following year, 12 months, they had a significant decrease in all upper respiratory illnesses, viral and bacterial. And that's a pretty amazing finding. And from that point, the drug has taken off in terms of being researched, both for its effect on the immune system, and as some of you probably know, in the world of anti-aging longevity, it's a big deal. It is like
Yeah, it's a huge deal.
yeah, it's
Because
the
of the
drug everybody
mTOR,
looks at.
and I think it's interesting that when they identified sort of the enzyme that it coalesces with, they named it after, after the drug, so the mammalian target of rapamycin. I mean, initially it wasn't a mammalian target. They had looked at in other species, and I forget
Right,
what it was. The TOR was the target of rapamycin, and then
right.
eventually although now I think the M stands for mechanistic and not
Yeah,
mammalian.
it's mechanistic, right?
Right.
Right.
But so dysregulated mTOR has been associated with not only aging, but cancer and diabetes and osteoporosis.
Right. Disease after disease after disease.
Exactly, exactly. And so it's just so interesting how to inhibit this particular enzyme can do so much. And it's considered anti-proliferative. In the course of immunosuppressants these days, I don't think it's actually considered a potent one or even a powerful one, though I know it's still used in transplant medicine, but it's really more anti-proliferative, so it prevents
Correct.
the proliferation of so it supports autophagy, and so
Right.
it prevents the proliferation of basically damaged cells and unhealthy cells, or cells with bad parts, as I say. And it really focuses on seemingly on some of the research, though I will say the research is so interesting because it just adds more and more like incredible qualities to this particular drug.
Yeah, it's
Because
layer after layer.
yeah, I mean, it's just so fascinating in that regard because it just sort of shows that it reduces the like the T and the B cell responses to cytokines, and I think specifically IL-2, but they've shown with other cytokines, whereas some of the older guards that we had used previously, like tacrolimus and cyclosporin, actually inhibits the cytokines themselves. But the rapamycin inhibits the T and B cell response
It's
to cytokines. So
yeah, it's a very different mechanism of action from
very
most other
different.
immunosuppressants. So
Right.
just to finish this out, I want to point out that the doses in the Manick trial are roughly 1/6 to 1/8 of the transplant doses. Okay, very, very low.
Very low.
And then a series of studies were done by the ITP, which is a federal NIH-supported study in 3 different sites, which intervention, treatment, I always forget what the P stands for. But basically, it's a longevity trial system with a treat mice, wild type mice, meaning not genetically selected, and to see what the outcome is survival-wise. And the rapamycin repeatedly had a survival increased age or decreased mortality of something in the range of 15 to 20%. Okay, so somewhere in there, about 3 years ago, I got a little obsessed with this drug because, as I've said to some people and some patients, and as I gave a talk at our MCAS meeting, I think the pathology of aging, what happens to us as we get older, which is a decline in our immune system and a decline in autophagy, mimics or is similar to what happens in our patients with chronic post-infectious illnesses, well, particularly post-infectious, but in general, patients with complex illness like ME/CFS and long COVID. And there's, we in another talk with another episode, I can point out over and over and over how similar this is, both biochemically and types of diseases that people get, et cetera. So started using rapamycin, and the whole point, as Eileen said, it inhibits mTOR, which is a protein, nutrient sensing protein that is present in every single living cellular being in the planet. Okay, so the point of that statement is it's been evolutionarily conserved. It has not changed, and when that happens, you know you've hit a gold mine. This is a really important protein. Okay, and in low doses, rapamycin inhibits mTOR and specifically what's called TORC1. There's two of them, TORC1 and TORC2, and by doing that, it increases autophagy. Autophagy is our waste management system. It's how we clean up garbage in our body. Dead cells, zombie cells, cells that are producing nasty cytokines, misfolded proteins, all the stuff that's part of living and doesn't, literally metabolic waste products. So it is a waste management system. And when autophagy declines, what do you think happens? A lot of crap builds up in our body, okay? So the idea is by promoting autophagy, it will decrease the diseases of aging, and that if you're studying longevity, and in our patients, it will decrease the buildup of these abnormal proteins and other kinds of cells.
Yeah, it's important to remember that, the cellular machinery is it's the health of the cellular machinery for cellular signaling is critical for cellular function. So when you have a buildup of these bad parts that interfere in the appropriate cellular signaling machinery, then those cells just don't function at all. I mean, they might just be suboptimally functioning where initially you don't, you might just not feel well kind of thing, or it might not be overt disease or overt specific symptoms, but over time, there's a buildup and an accumulation, and those cells just are no longer functioning even close to normal at all, and they start functioning quite abnormally. And then whatever organ that cell resides in, that organ is now affected, and so that organ function then is affected. And so as you've said, this is present in every cell. And so when we think about multi-organ involvement, which is what our patients often have, even though we might not have yet identified it, I know it exists. And it's only, I feel sometimes with some patients, only a matter of time. And I know that we've seen this when we have both followed patients over many, many years. And all of a sudden, some lab will show that another organ is not working properly. And you're like, what's that? Then you have to go chasing that down and sort of think, well, what's happening here? Let's make sure we're not missing something. And so, yeah, so that's how important this is. And I feel like we can't stress that enough. And it's why the longevity world has kidnapped this drug.
Exactly. And I should emphasize, it's not only its role as an mTOR inhibitor, there are other things that the drug does in terms of various cascades related to AMPK.
Absolutely.
Another way to think of it is that it's a intermittent fasting mimetic or a calorie restriction mimetic, meaning it imitates what the benefits are when you calorie restrict can be imitated or created by taking rapamycin. So it is...
yeah, I mean, and just speaking of that, I mean, one of the other functions is, it binds to the FK binding proteins, which has that isomerase kind of activity. So it's very much involved in like protein folding and protein accumulation. And of course, proteins are the way the body signals and the body communicates ways cells. And And so I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but it is such a critical, it's got so many different mechanisms. I wouldn't say different, but because there's a lot of overlap, but the mechanism of action of rapamycin is so incredibly, I don't know, magical. Is the best word to come up with.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And we use it, not only, I mean, we use it for a lot of abnormal proliferative disorders. Like, so in neurology, we regularly use it for tuberous sclerosis, and I often tell patients that, but we also use it for neurofibromatosis. We
But
even
in higher doses, higher doses.
at higher,
In
oh
higher
yeah, much
doses,
higher
yeah.
dosages, absolutely, much higher dosages. But we also have used it for things like superficial arteriovenous malformations, large ones, because it actually also will help prevent the growth of new vessels. So, and when they're abnormally growing, that's actually a good thing. So there's a lot of really interesting uses of it just because of its mechanism of action. But go ahead.
Right. So just to reference what you just said, Eileen, so it is, if mTOR is inhibited, then it creates a catabolic state, meaning you're not building new proteins, which I've struggled with because it's very counterintuitive. I would think I want new proteins and my patients want new proteins. But the problem is that building may not be happening in a healthy, structured way. And when you turn it, inhibit mTOR, that changes everything for that reason. I do want to point out, just as a quick aside, that a lot of what mTOR, inhibition of mTOR is doing by elevating autophagy is somewhat similar to why we think plasmapheresis works, because that plasma is filled with that junk that hasn't been cleaned up by impaired autophagy. And where that, through autophagy, it can happen on a daily basis at a low volume level. Plasmapheresis is turning up the gain, and suddenly in one day, you're taking out 2 liters of plasma and 2 liters of junk, okay? So there is a significant similarity between the two. Okay, so let me talk for a second about adverse effects of RAPA, and then I want to go into our trial that we've been doing and some of the results I've seen both with patients and you've seen with patients outside of the trial and then inside the trial. So important to note, it's a magical drug, but no free lunches anywhere in the world, including in medicine, okay? It does have toxicity. In the low doses, it's very small levels of toxicity. And one of the problems we encounter is with most other physicians, if they have a patient of mine or Eileen's, the doctor will say, you're taking rapamycin, it's got a big black box that says it's immunosuppressive and you're going to get sepsis and die and cancer and all this crap. It's just not true in these doses. And somehow we have to get that message across to the medical world, okay? And this is not something that's just coming from 2 crazy doctors here. This is widely accepted, what I'm saying. Okay, so toxicity. There's really, what I would say, 3 main things in the low dose. It can cause canker sores in your mouth. They're very unpleasant. They're not at all common. It's the most common side effect, but it's rare. I've probably treated over 100 patients now, and literally 2 or 3 have had canker sores or mouth sores. They're easy to manage with some steroid dental paste, and it's somewhat idiosyncratic, meaning it's not always based on the dose level. You stop the dose, it goes away, you restart, and you're fine. Okay. The other 2 side effects that are significant that we monitor are it can raise glucose levels, all right? So it can raise glucose intolerance or insulin resistance. And we believe that's from activation or, inhibition of TORC2, and it can raise cholesterol, all right? Both of those are a result of inhibiting TORC2. And here's a key point. When you inhibit TORC2, it implies the dose you're using is too high. So I said 6 milligrams a week, but you and I are different, Eileen. Maybe you need 4 and I need 8. We don't know. That's one of the big questions here. And so when we're treating patients, or when I'm treating patients, I follow the lipid panel and the glucose and the hemoglobin A1C. And if they rise, I will decrease the dose. And Joan Manick, the doctor I mentioned, physician scientist I mentioned before, has done some really nice work to show that the significance and accuracy of that statement. I'll always counsel patients there's a risk of infection. It's mostly because they're going to read it, okay? I have not yet had a single patient have an increased risk of infections, all right?
I haven't even seen
those
labs.
Pretty much the side effects. I mean,
yeah, I was going to say I haven't even seen labs show any kind of immunosuppression.
No.
So
yeah, and I follow labs at least monthly for 3 months. both
Yeah.
in the study and in my patients. I've never actually seen the CBC, the blood counts change or the liver enzymes change. It's just being cautious and prudent. Okay.
And then it is metabolized by P453A, so sometimes it's worth just sort of checking what other drugs patients are on. I think it's 3A4, but
Yeah, 3A4.
yeah. And
But
so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, so there are some drugs that are not, uncommonly used that can be potentially can affect that same enzyme. So sometimes it's important to just go through their list of drugs.
And it's important to
Rifampin is the drug that you commonly use.
right. Drives me crazy, the drug. But it's a very important point that you're bringing up, Eileen, because, I said 6 milligrams a week. However, your 3A4 may be different from my 3A4, and therefore that will just change the dosing. And the other question, which I'll come back to in a minute, is the bioavailability of the rapamycin pill you're taking. Rapamycin is generic, so inexpensive, widely available in multiple genetic brands, and each one may have different bioavailability. And that's not a criticism of generics, it's just the way this stuff works, okay? And that's been a big concern of ours in the study that we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not widely bioavailable though, right? So it's from the pharmacokinetics, I think it's got a lot of variability in general.
I don't know if that's true.
Okay. Do you tell them to take it with food or on an empty stomach, or do you not mention it at all?
I usually suggest with food and tell them not to take it with grapefruit juice, because grapefruit juice, like rifampin and these other drugs, affects 3A4 and can boost the level too high.
Okay.
In the aging longevity world, the biohacking world, lots of people take it with grapefruit juice to save money on purchasing the pills. I think that's a little nuts because you don't really know how high you're pushing it.
Right.
And then I think you're playing with taking chances.
Fun fact, rapamycin was my very first assignment in the journal club during residency. So many years ago, I actually gave a talk on rapamycin from some random article that was assigned to me in the very first journal club of my neurology residency. And I'm sure lots of things have changed since then because I'm 100 years old. But I do remember that there is some, and it might be related to either sirolimus and or everolimus, and I think that they differ in terms of their variability and their bioavailability. But I recall that there's lower bioavailability with food for at least one of them. And so I regularly say try to take almost like we do with cromolyn, try to take it 30 minutes before a meal kind of thing. But
we should double check
it's
that,
only taken
both of
once
us,
a week,
because I'm pretty sure with food is better than not with food in terms of absorption. There's a company I'm going to mention later, but I'll just say now, called Ageless RX, and they've actually published a paper, a pretty elegant paper looking at the bioavailability of the generic drugs, versions of sirolimus. Okay.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And sirolimus, by the way, is the generic name for rapamycin, so we don't confuse people. Okay, so a couple of years ago, I started prescribing rapamycin. It's a little scary. I mean, I'm not a oncologist or a neurologist or an immunologist, and certainly this is off-label use of the drug. But I was pretty convinced from the literature. And I have to say, overall, I've generally seen significant improvements in our patients in terms of decreased pain, decreased brain fog, and decreased fatigue.
For sure.
Not 100%. My impression, my sense from patients is it's somewhere between 50 and 65%, half to two-thirds. Pretty much zero side effects. Some patients didn't like how they felt and they would just stop. That's fine. Other patients, we would titrate the dose down or up. Some patients discovered they did better on 1 milligram a day. Interesting, if you reference back to the Manick study in 2007, that was one of the arms. But it was clearly helping patients at no cost, no adverse event cost. Some patients said, oh, this isn't doing anything, and they would stop it, and then they'd message me and say, oh, wait a minute, it definitely was doing something because I don't feel so good now. And their pain would come back, things like that. Okay, so around a year ago, I met with two investigators from Cimarron, which is a MECFS research group out of Incline Village, where there was an epidemic of MECFS decades ago. And they had the same interest, a similar interest, and they had done and are doing some pretty amazing work. This is Gunnar Gottschalk and Avik Roy. And we decided to put a trial together. And before I go into that, let me just give you a little info on what they had already learned. They had discovered proteins that were autophagy-related proteins, some of which were elevated when autophagy was inhibited, decreased, and some of which decreased when autophagy increased. Okay, so that became a biomarker to assess whether the inhibition of mTOR was effective or not, which was a key missing piece of how do we determine dosing and efficacy. They had already done work, and Eileen, you might not know this, and I should send you this paper because you're going to really like it. So they published a paper in a mouse model where they showed that inhibition of autophagy led to an elevation of interleukin-6, another cytokine called RANTES, R-A-N-T-E-S, which led to, and that occurred through another pathway called STAT3. I'm not a biochemist, so I don't know this stuff too well. But the key piece that I can understand is that in those mice where that occurred, they developed demyelination of the nerves innervating muscles, and they presented clinically, in quotes, as a post-exertional malaise picture. In other words, when they did their treadmill testing on these mice, the mice that had the demyelination had a post-exertional fatigue that was similar to PEM and ME/CFS patients.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty amazing thing. I'm not suggesting that our patients or that me or you, as you get older, are having demyelination, but we do, I wonder what is going on. Why do people, as they get older, have sarcopenia, loss of muscle mass? Could this be a reason? Why do our ME/CFS complex illness patients, long COVID patients, have post-exertional malaise? Could this be the link? And that's one of the goals of this kind of work.
Well, that's really interesting to me. And I don't want to get off topic, of course, but as you know, I occasionally will do an LP on a patient, and I I wouldn't say regularly, but not infrequently find elevated protein, which is often thought to be a marker of demyelination, though it could be a marker of other things, but without any other abnormalities. And so I just, you're making me think, like, I wonder how further we can take this demyelinating question in our patients. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm sorry.
it
I
could
know.
be. No,
I'm the tangent queen.
These episodes are all about tangents. I think that's how we learn a lot too.
Right, exactly.
And I think I reread this paper last night in preparation for today, and it's like I was one of those, holy mackerel, this could be a really big deal.
Yeah.
Explaining some of this, and I have to speak with Gunnar to see if we can add in some other biomarkers in the human study.
I think we should
To help us learn this
and
figure
just
this
speaking
out.
of the myelin, of course, and most of our patients, if not all of them, have some level of mast cell activation, and there are proteases that break down the myelin, and we've spoken about this before, but the degradation products of the myelin actually provoke more mast cell response, so it's almost like this vicious cycle. So all of this can be very much interconnected, but again,
and rapamycin can decrease mast cell activation.
There you go.
So
Oh my
again,
gosh.
Connections. All right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Pretty exciting.
Mind blown. Ideas swirling.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right.
So basically we started a study, which is, I can explain it very quickly because it was based on what I was already doing. So we selected patients with an ME/CFS or long COVID diagnosis. And I'll come back to that in 1 second. And the protocol was 1 milligram of rapamycin once a week, increasing by 1 milligram a week. So 6 weeks to get to the target of 6 milligrams a week. Again, no proof that's the right dose, based purely, it's kind of like LDN and 4.5 milligrams. It's like a legend, 4.5. This is a little bit more than a legend because we have the Manick studies and a lot of biohacking studies that 6 milligrams looks right, but I'm sure it's not absolutely right for every single patient, but that's what we did. And baseline study labs, and baseline CBC and lipid and metabolic panel, and then monthly for 3 months minimum follow-up labs and follow-up study labs. And at the same time, a series of surveys, all done online, which is another beauty of this study. It's decentralized online. It's just all done on the internet. And the surveys are for cognitive and fatiguing illnesses and things like that. It's called MFI and the SF-36, and then we follow those. Okay. All right. So here's the punchline. After 3 months, we have enough data after 3 months, and this will be published shortly. So I can't give full details because of all this stupid publication rules. Okay. 25 patients so far who have completed everything. In 50% of the, in roughly 27% of those patients, 30% of those patients, the changes in the autophagy markers were clear and obvious, and they were correlated highly with improvements in the 2 survey tools I mentioned. Okay, so it wasn't just a biochemical change and the patient still feels like garbage. The patient was feeling better too.
Wow.
What I found really interesting, and I was back and forth last night on emails with Gunnar to clarify this, is that the other 20%, because I said 50%, 20% did not have changes in their protein markers for autophagy, but they did have improvements in their survey tools. Meaning there's more than one mechanism, which is not a surprise if you remember what we just talked about with this drug. Yeah. Okay. The other 50% have not seen that kind of improvement either in the tools or in their proteins. But I want to emphasize it's only 25 people and it's only 3 months. And I think that we should not jump to a conclusion that it's only 50%, but I would emphasize finding a drug that's 50% effective in a population, any population, is incredible in medicine. Finding it in a complex illness population is extraordinary. So 50% is not a level to be depressed by.
No, not at all.
It's
and where
huge.
does the study, I mean, can we still enroll patients in the study?
Yes.
Where does it stand?
Thank you. Great. So we're about to begin phase 2 of this study, or a second study, to expand the numbers for the obvious reasons. And there'll be some changes in the second phase. So patients in the first phase can continue and will continue to check their labs and their surveys. In phase 2, and actually I think we'll roll phase 1 into what I'm about to say as well, because of the concern I have and raised with Gunnar and the group about bioavailability of the different prescriptions, we wanted to have a single source of drug, meaning all patients get the same drug. And I don't care what brand it is or what source it is, but everybody has to take the same drug, because that will get rid of the bioavailability variability to a degree, but not a complete degree, because there's still the issue with food and grapefruit juice and CYP453A4. Okay. So in order to do that, we partnered, and again, this is not something people do in these studies usually, so it's another new thing. We partnered with an actual industry company, a profit-making company called Ageless RX. And the reason is they already have set up the infrastructure to sell these drugs online. So it's like those companies that have sell testosterone or Viagra or Cialis and stuff. You go online, you type in key, and you meet with a doctor for 5 minutes and you get your drugs. But they're already set up. And more importantly, they have studied and written a beautiful paper that I referenced a minute ago, the difference in bioavailability between purchased generic versions of sirolimus and compounded sirolimus. And what was interesting is in the generic version, why variation in bioavailability? In the compounded, not surprisingly, a consistent bioavailable picture because it's made by one compounding pharmacy. The difference was the compounded product or drug was less bioavailable overall, so it needed a higher dose to equal the generic, which was also a very important finding because some of the patients have already been getting it compounded at the lower 6 milligram dose. And it turned out that 15 milligrams in the compounded was equivalent to 6 in most of the...
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So since they're compounding it, they can't alter how they compound it to try to better match the non-compounded.
Maybe they could, but what does it matter? If we know 15 milligrams is equivalent, that's fine, you know?
Right.
I think it has to do with enteric coatings and acid in the stomach, but I'm not fully sure.
Okay.
So by partnering with them, we will get this compounded version, and we will also run the lab work through them because
Oh,
as many of the patients have discovered it, number one, they have to be reminded to get their monthly labs, and number two, we had a system where a phlebotomist would come to their home. That didn't always work out the way it should. So this company will just facilitate that because they already do that when somebody randomly buys their rapamycin. They won't sell the rapamycin to some random patient
oh,
online
wow.
unless that patient is getting the labs done, which
Okay.
is kind of gives you an idea of how
Yeah.
legit the company is. Um, so the rest of the studies is similar. There'll be baseline and subsequent study labs, although we're expanding the number of proteins and markers that are being looked at, and the survey tools will continue as well. So that is actually geared to get going very quickly. There's an investigators meeting, which I sent you the information
Thank you. Thank
in
you
a
for
week or
inviting me.
so. Yep. And when I say investigators, so it's me. Eileen is going to be joining. There's Dr. Gratch at Mayo. There's a couple of people at Bateman Horn. Bella Cheddar are the partners in California's in it, and I figured some other names. I'm sorry if I didn't name all the people. And we hope to expand to at least another 100 patients in study.
Yeah.
And essentially, the only thing holding us back is funding, minor
Yeah.
detail.
Right. I think the
So,
study definitely needs funding. I mean, I think there's a
yeah,
lot to show, and I think that you and I have been involved in this complex illness world for a very long time, and I think that I think it's safe to say that we are both fairly excited about this drug and the preliminary findings. And so I would love to sort of see this be a larger study and a larger trial. And if we can get the funding to do it, then we should.
yeah. I mean, I think it's critically important. This drug is likely to be effective and helpful for such a huge world of patients. And, we can broaden it. I say ME/CFS and long COVID, but there's a whole world of post-infectious fatiguing illness patients out there, dengue and Zika,
Hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. And that's only going to grow larger. I mean, we're going to have a bird flu epidemic probably, and maybe a monkeypox. I'm serious, and
I
we're not
know.
ready for it. And
It was in
now
the news
we
this
have
morning.
people coming in that don't believe in epidemics and pandemics. So,
Right.
the shit's going to hit the fan. Sorry.
No, I
Um,
completely agree. Even more reason why we just sort of have to take this upon ourselves to sort of figure
right,
this out and help as many as we could, because I agree. I think that there's just another pandemic around the corner. I think that our exposures, and it's not only infectious always, but I think for the most part, it's infectious, and there's just another one waiting for us. And so
right.
we all often talk about genetic susceptibility. So it may not be a true pandemic as we had experienced with COVID, but there's still going to be a subset of people that are vulnerable to whatever the new infection agent is, even though it might not be a worldwide pandemic as we had experienced. So I think regardless, we need to find ways of helping people and treating them so that people remain productive and functional forevermore, despite.
Well, and the knowledge that could come out of this is huge. So as a
Yeah.
side example, although it's politically risky to use the word vaccine, um, as Manick showed, it improved vaccine efficacy.
Hmm.
So there should be a study,
Yeah.
looking at people before they get their vaccine, give them a dose, like 3 weeks of rapamycin, placebo, and see who responds better to their COVID vaccine or to their
Right.
flu vaccine or whatever. Um, so I think it's very cutting edge and really important. I think it's um, very frustrating how difficult it is to get funding, and
Yeah.
particularly frustrating when I see the academic centers getting all the funding. And as you may know, I'm sure you know, Eileen, and some of the listeners, um, there was this big announcement, hullabaloo, oh, this is so cool because Mount Sinai and PolyBio are funding a study with Petrino to do the exact same trial.
Right.
All right. And they're getting, I forget the number, but it's in the multi-millions to do it. And, we're doing this trial. We've already completed phase 1. We've done all this work, and we can run this trial for 1/10 of what they'll send into Sinai's bank account to do the trial. So it's
Right.
sorry for the editorial, but it's very, very frustrating to me.
No, it is frustrating. And I think that this actually just sort of it speaks to the larger, I think, a larger problem in general, which is that the institutions seem to get a lot of the focus, but I always, talk with the frontline physicians,
Right.
boots on the ground kind of people. And we have the patients, we see the patients, we've been treating the patients for years and years and years. And so we have we have insight. And yeah, and I think that
Well,
actually, that has value, that is often not as recognized as it should be, in my opinion. But that's okay. I've always sort of been a bootstrap kind of gal, as you have, frankly.
yeah.
And so, we just find a way. And I think that, and one of the ways, of course, that and it's the whole reason why we set out to do our podcast, right? It was like the genesis of all of this,
Right.
that we wanted to get this information out there and show what we see, what we know, what we hope for, what we treat, how, what we want to do, what we want to prove, what we think, all of that. So yeah, and I think I'm excited about this trial, and I'm
Yeah.
hoping that we can get the funding. So
Yeah.
anyone
But
out there,
sorry.
no, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you were going to do
I
something,
was going
say
to say,
something
anyone out
important.
there has any ideas for funding sources, send them Dr. Kaufman's way.
Right. I mean, I just want to echo or reiterate what you said. It's very frustrating that people like us, and there are hundreds of us, not just the two of us, who are on the front line every day taking care of patients, every day learning about these drugs, every day trialing the drugs, every day willing to go off label and say, oh, this science looks interesting. Let's just give this drug a try. Let's try pentoxifylline, which used to work for peripheral arterial disease. Maybe it'll help blood flow in our patients, that kind of thing. And yet, the academic people, they don't even ask. I mean, they set up this trial. They didn't say, oh, how's it going? I have no problem with doing a repeat trial. That's how good science is done. You don't want a trial from a single center or single group. You want multiple groups to see if the findings are consistent, but you also want to learn from each other and collaborate instead of compete. And it just gets me crazy. Plus it wastes so much money.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger problem. It just wastes a lot of money, a lot of time too. Patients are suffering,
Yeah.
And so, and it, you spend days in the clinic just watching and trying to help people, and it just becomes a very frustrating experience because you want to just get them well today, tomorrow. So to sort of wait for bureaucracy to take its place and to have, everything in order to get any kind of trial off the ground can be a really frustrating experience in general, in science and medicine. And we have said a million times, we totally get the benefit of evidence-based medicine. We get it, but our patients are suffering now. So we say that.
And when it's done this way, the way we're doing it, and the way other trials we've done, like the oxaloacetate, it happens very fast. You have the idea, and this is a trial that we got off the ground, I think, in 3 months. All right. My guess is, and I hate to be picking on Sinai and Polybio, but my guess is it'll be 6 to 12 months before they even start, enrolling patients. And the reason is less bureaucracy, less I's to dot and T's to cross, less groups to get permission from. We don't have multiple departments, it's kind of like just our tiny little office. And the same with Gunnar and Avik. They're just a small group. Cimarron is a small group. So I think it's a potential model for how to run these studies in the future, this decentralized internet-based trials. So we just need funding.
Yeah,
anyone out there has some money they'd like to donate.
Yeah, I think it's a difference between clinical studies and research studies, frankly. So, and I think that we are very well housed to do clinical trials and clinical studies on a smaller scale. And we have the patients, we have access to the patients, and our patients are always willing to be part of studies, and I think that that's what we offer, and that's what we'll continue to offer.
Right.
So, but yes, if we can get support, then we can even do more of that. And I think that's the most important point.
I agree.
All right. Well, I think this was a really good conversation about rapamycin because we have both been recommending it and prescribing it. And I think a lot of patients had a lot of questions, which, we answer, of course, but I think this was a good conversation to have as part of our podcast series now on YouTube. And we will post this and see.
And speaking of YouTube, please tell your friends and families and doctors about it. Please subscribe.
Sure.
The whole reason we moved to YouTube was to increase the number of people seeing these things. We still would like to think they're valuable not only to patients, but to the healthcare community. So, just spread the word. It's free, so that's no longer a impediment. So subscribe and
Send
tell
it by
everyone
carrier
else.
pigeon.
Right. Right. And we'll continue to monitor the Patreon site for comments and things. And I think we're going to try to make the YouTube site work for comments as well. I don't know if we'll be able to answer every comment if we get all those subscribers you're going to send us, but we'll try.
Yes, absolutely. And we will have we're going to schedule another live for January. And we will announce those dates probably on the Patreon. Yeah. So sign up for on Patreon but free. I think that's a real important,
Yeah, a good point.
If you're on the free Patreon, then you get all of our announcements. So we tend to, I don't know how to announce on YouTube. We have to learn more about YouTube, David. But on Patreon, we can announce like dates of our live. And so you would get that announcement. So that would be helpful, but you do not have to pay. So.
Right. And send us questions, send us things you'd like, topics you'd like us to discuss and address. And I guess that's it. I was going to say something else, but I just forgot it. Okay.
I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving Day weekend, and we're going to see you a lot in December. We're going to really get very active with our plans and our podcast.
Right. And I remember, just to remind people, we will be progressively dropping or moving the Patreon episodes over to YouTube. So they'll be available. Yeah.
Good point. They will be available. We're going to start to move them slowly, but regularly from Patreon to the YouTube. So just be on the lookout for those and be sure to subscribe. So I think you have to click a button down there somewhere. I see other YouTubers do stuff like that.
I was going to say, now I feel like a true YouTuber. Please subscribe, hit the like button.
Okay. We'll figure it out. Us dinosaurs will get it. All right. All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.